Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the small island of Corsica, is one of the most famous men to have ever lived, hailed as the man of the 19th century. Even his very name is used as a word to describe something momentous, colossal, Napoleonic. A rags to riches story, Napoleon was only 24 years old when he became a general, and 35 when he crowned himself Emperor of the French. Charismatic leader of men, brilliant politician, and a military genius, Napoleon fought 60 battles in his career and only lost 7 of them, making him the most victorious general in history. Not since the days of ancient Rome and the Caesars had one man conquered so much of Europe, or held so much power. The so-called man of destiny and a mass of contradictions, Napoleon remains something of an enigma, at times a hopeless romantic idealist, and the bitterest of cynics. His iron will, sheer intellect, and of course his fiery temperament, captivated or alarmed. To some he was a god, to others the Antichrist. And his meteoric rise and then crushing downfall has been compared to a Greek tragedy. After less than 15 years in power, in the last of 7 wars formed against him by coalitions of European monarchs, Napoleon was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled to the remote rocky island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. At the end of his life, reflecting on his misfortunes, Napoleon's analysis was, "I have too much ambition and a spirit of fire." This is the story of Napoleon and the dawn of a new age. After Napoleon's victory over the Mamelukes at the Battle of the Pyramids, Cairo was engulfed in panic as its terrified people loaded up their belongings and tried to flee. They could see the flaming and glowing sky. All through the night, as Napoleon remembered, the minarets of Cairo were lit up by the swirling flames from the burning fleet on the Nile. Their glimmer reflected on the walls of the pyramids. Parts of Cairo were now abandoned and in ashes after being torched by the Mamelukes in their frantic withdrawal, but many in the city thought the French had entered it and were burning it down. The local men threw dust on their heads and beat their chests, while women howled, raising up their arms to the flickering sky. Others began breaking into the deserted Mameluke palaces, looting them and setting them on fire. Masses of people streamed towards the gates, but outside the city in the darkness, Bedouin tribesmen were waiting for them. They began setting on the screaming refugees, tearing jewelry from the women, cutting through men's clothes to find hidden pouches of valuables, stripping others naked in their frenzied greed. Napoleon quickly sent a group of French troops into the city to restore order and protect people and property. In the words of Captain Malou, "We departed for Cairo at night. Hardly had we penetrated the cramped and tortuous alleyways than the flicker and glimmer of flames above the rooftops made us realize that parts of the city were on fire. We did not meet a single person on our way. Only the frightened ullalooing of the women, locked inside their harems, made us realize the city was inhabited." As the French soldiers wound their way through the dark streets, they were led by beating drums. According to one soldier, this unusual noise inspired terror in the inhabitants, although another claimed that the sole purpose of the drummers was to prevent the soldiers at the back from losing their way in the maze of dark streets. In the end, even their Egyptian guide got lost, and General Dupuy, who Napoleon had just named governor of Cairo, was unable to lead his men to their intended destination in the European quarter. After wandering around aimlessly, they eventually found themselves outside the gates of an abandoned Mameluke mansion and broke into it while the troops camped out in the empty courtyard. On the 24th of July, Napoleon himself crossed the Nile and reviewed his 4 divisions in front of the walls of Cairo. Coming out to meet him was a delegation of sheikhs and ulema, offering him the keys to the city gates in an act of symbolic submission. After a short ceremony, the trumpets sounded a fanfare, there was a roll of drums, and Napoleon rode into the city at the head of some grenadiers. Now the streets were full and lined with spectators, all curious to catch a glimpse of the infidel conqueror. But here in Cairo, this was no triumphal entry like it had been in Milan. Napoleon was prepared to find Cairo a poor city, and poor it proved to be. It was a prime example of absentee kingship and a ruling class of foreign birth. Aside from 3 fine mosques and the Mamelukes' palaces, Cairo was a sprawling mass of hovels and bazaars, with little for sale except pumpkins, fly-blown dates, camel cheese, and thin bland bread like dry pancakes. But that, after all, was one of the main points of the expedition: to liberate, to teach, and to develop. Napoleon declared, in proclamations which were posted throughout the city, "Residents of Cairo, I am pleased with your behaviour. I have come to destroy the Mamelukes, protect trade, and the country's native inhabitants. Let those who are consumed by fear find peace. Let those who have departed return. Let prayer go on today as usual. Do not fear for your families, homes, property, and especially for the religion of the Prophet, whom I greatly love." Napoleon set up his headquarters in the abandoned palace of Elfi Bey, ex-governor of Cairo. This was the most modern and luxurious palace in the city, set among gardens with cypress and orange trees, while its grand front terrace, with marble pillars and polished as one granite floors, looked out over the large open park, Escapaya Square, which, for part of the year, was flooded by the waters of the Nile and became a lake. For the first time, the French found European luxuries in Egypt, and part of the night was spent exploring the exotic mansion. The front hall boasted a large ornamental fountain, and each of its lavish main rooms had gilt mirrors, damask curtains, and silk-woven Persian carpets. Unusually for a Mameluke palace, it also had chairs and sunken baths. As Napoleon recalled, none of the slaves or servants had remained in Cairo. Nothing of its interior decor remotely resembled a European palace. The staff officers were delighted to move into a house so well furnished, with divans upholstered by Lyons silk and gold tassels, and other such dizzying luxuries of European craftsmanship. The garden was full of beautiful trees. There was a great trellis covered with vines, from which hung bunches of excellent grapes, which proved a precious discovery. Word of this spread through the camp, attracting crowds of soldiers, and the harvest was soon over. Many of Napoleon's generals were lodged in these deserted Mameluke palaces, and even the leading scholars moved into a fine mansion on this square. Other officers, as well as the troops, had to make do with lesser accommodation, with many often camping out in courtyards. Up until now, most of the French had barely come into contact with the locals, and when they first ventured into the teeming streets of Cairo, they were in for a culture shock. The reaction of Major de Troyes of the engineers was typical, infused with the era's European prejudices. On entering Cairo, what do you find? Narrow streets, unpaved and filthy, shadowy houses often in ruins. Even the public houses seem like dungeons. Shops are nothing better than stables. The air is filled with dust and the reek of garbage. You see men with one milky eye, others totally blind. Men in beards, clothed in rags, swarming through crowded alleyways, or smoking pipes, squatting like monkeys before the entrance to their caves. And as for the women, nature's masterpiece elsewhere in the world, here they are hideous and revolting, hiding their emaciated faces behind reeking threadbare veils, their children yellow and skinny, covered in suppurating sores, surrounded by flies. Hideous smells come from the filthy interiors, and you choke on the risen dust together with the odour of food being fried in rancid oil in stuffy bazaars. After his sightseeing tour, de Troyes returned to his Cairo abode, evidently not one of the Mameluke palaces. A place devoid of human comforts, of proper living space, the flies, the midges, 1,000 insects of all sorts, waiting to pounce on you in the night. Soaked in sweat, prostrate with exhaustion, instead of resting, you spend the time boiling and itching. In the morning, you get up in a foul temper, your eyes swollen, sick in your stomach, your skin covered in bites, which have by now been scratched septic. And so another day begins, no different from the last. Memoir after memoir lists the complaints in these unfamiliar surroundings. But reactions were not always completely negative. Young Captain Malou pragmatically commented, "In the face of all this, one realised that it was necessary to renounce our European behaviour and to behave as they did. Unfortunately, during the first days, we experienced all that was despicable in their Turkish behaviour, and none of the delights." Napoleon himself observed, "It would be difficult to find a richer land, and a more wretched, ignorant, and brutish people." The Egyptian reaction to the French was also double-edged. Al-Jabati recorded his wonder at the soldiers walking about the streets of the city without weapons and not harming anyone. They joked with our people, and in the bazaars bought whatever they wanted. They went on buying bread no matter how high the prices rose. The bakers, to increase their profits, reduced the size of their loaves and mixed in dust with the flour. Another local, Nicholas the Turk, noted how the French easily pardoned their enemies, showing themselves open and indulgent, observing justice, making good rules, and passing good laws. However, in spite of all these efforts, they were not able to win over the hearts of the people. The Muslims hid their hatred for these people. Napoleon quickly declared Ottoman and Mamluk rule at an end, and put the running of Cairo into the hands of a council of 9 sheikhs, advised by a French commissioner. In the meantime, Napoleon raced after the retreating Mamelukes, caught up with them in the Sinai desert, and beat them decisively at Salahai. He also captured their gold and jewel treasures, which he divided among his men as rewards for their courage and endurance. Having taken Cairo, and with the Mamelukes scattered and on the run, Napoleon's dreams of eastern conquest seemed to be coming true. In high spirits after his victory at Salahai, Napoleon opened a letter that had just arrived from Alexandria. It contained disastrous news, which ultimately sealed the fate of the expedition. Admiral Bruyer, keen to ensure that Napoleon had gained a foothold in Egypt before leaving him and the army behind to their fate, had delayed withdrawing the French fleet from the Bay of Aboukir to a less exposed position. As Napoleon had expressly ordered, "I hope that as I write you this letter, you are in the harbour with your squadron, safe and sound. I haven't received a single letter from you since leaving Alexandria. Please let me know as soon as possible what you have been doing up to this time, and in what situation you are now." A few days after entering Cairo, Napoleon had received dispatches from Admiral Bruyer, from which he learnt that the French fleet was still in the Bay of Aboukir, vulnerable to attack by the English fleet, which was still on the prowl. Astonished by this, Napoleon hastily sent a messenger to tell the admiral of his disapproval, warning him to immediately sail the fleet, either into the harbour of Alexandria, where it would be safe, or to make for Corfu. Unfortunately, the messenger was assassinated en route by a band of Arabs, but would not have been able to reach Aboukir in time anyway. Admiral Nelson, meanwhile, had learned that the French had landed in Egypt and had been continuing the hunt for them. It is an old saying, "The devil's children have the devil's luck." I cannot find, or at this moment learn, where the French fleet are gone to. 40-year-old Horatio Nelson, England's greatest naval commander, had been born into a moderately prosperous family as the son of a village priest, and retained a strong Christian faith throughout his life. Thanks to his uncle, a high-ranking naval officer, Nelson had been taken to sea as a teenage boy when his mother died. Famously, he would suffer from seasickness throughout his naval career. Fighting at sea, during the American War of Independence to reclaim the colonies for England. When this war was lost and he returned, Nelson contemplated standing for Parliament as a Tory MP and supporter of Prime Minister William Pitt, but was unable to find a seat. Nelson was later again posted to the West Indies, where by rigidly enforcing the Navigation Act against American merchant ships, he made enemies not only among their merchants and ship captains, who sued him for illegal seizure, but also among British authorities there. Afterwards, for the next few years, Nelson fell into disfavour with the Admiralty, living on half-pay with his new wife. When France and England went to war, Nelson took part in the siege of Toulon in 1793, at which Napoleon had also famously commanded, and was sent to Naples to collect reinforcements, where he befriended the English minister there, Sir William Hamilton, and his vivacious young wife, Emma, with whom Nelson would later have a famously scandalous affair. When the English lost Toulon, Nelson and the fleet instead sailed to Corsica to try to capture Bastia and Calvi, where a French shot flung debris into Nelson's face, leaving his right eye almost sightless. Eventually, the English were forced to abandon these Mediterranean bases and retreated to Gibraltar. During the Battle of Cape St. Vincent against the Spanish fleet, without orders from his commanding admiral, Nelson audaciously had his ship attack the Spanish. While the rest of the English fleet slowly turned up in support, Nelson held the two Spanish squadrons apart, at one point fighting several enemy ships. After an hour exchanging broadsides with one Spanish ship, according to some accounts, he led a boarding party across to capture her, which was completely unheard of for an English naval commander, crying, "Westminster Abbey, all glorious victory," and forced her to surrender. The victory at Cape St. Vincent won Nelson a knighthood and promotion to Rear Admiral. But his first battle in command of a major independent force was disastrous. During a failed attack on Spanish ships at Tenerife, Nelson was struck by grapeshot and had to have his arm amputated. Arriving wounded back at his ship, he refused to be helped aboard, declaring, "Let me alone. I have yet legs left and one arm. Tell the surgeon to make haste and get me his instruments. I know I must lose my right arm, and the sooner it is off, the better." Despite this defeat, Nelson was met with a hero's welcome in England, and his wound earned him sympathy. While recovering, Nelson missed the English victory over the Dutch at the naval battle of Camperdown, which, he said, he found so frustrating that he'd have happily given his other arm for the chance to take part. Meanwhile, he had now been put in command of hunting down Napoleon and the French fleet. Key to Nelson's personality was his impetuous bravery, his ambition, and his devotion to duty, his faith, to his king and his country. In line with this, he also had an overwhelming hatred of the French. "There are three things, young gentlemen," Nelson said to one of his midshipmen, "which you are constantly to bear in mind. First, you must always implicitly obey orders, without attempting to form any opinion of your own respecting their propriety. Secondly, you must consider every man your enemy who speaks ill of your king. And thirdly, you must hate a Frenchman as you do the devil." Nelson's views on this were often expressed and deep-seated. "Down, down with the French" is my constant prayer. "Down, down with the French" ought to be written in the council room of every country in the world, for all must be a republic if the emperor does not act with expedition and vigour. There is no way of dealing with a Frenchman but to knock him down. My principle is to assist in driving the French to the devil. To the Duke of Clarence, he wrote, "To serve my king and to destroy the French, I consider as the great order of all, from which little ones spring, and if one of these militate against it, I go back and obey the great order and object to down, down with the damned French villains. My blood boils at the name of Frenchmen." After 2.5 months of fruitless searching, at 6 p.m. on the 1st of August, just 10 days after the Battle of the Pyramids, the English fleet majestically entered the Bay of Aboukir and closed in on the exposed French ships. Their forces were roughly equal. Admiral Bruet had 13 ships of the line and 4 frigates, anchored in a semicircle, compared to Nelson's 14 ships of the line and a brig. Nelson's plan of attack was simple but bold, and from the outset, victory was almost certain. Nelson concentrated his whole force against half of the French ships, using the same tactics at sea which Napoleon had found so successful on land. One of Nelson's crew declared, "If we succeed, what will the world say?" "There is no if in the case," Nelson replied. "That we shall succeed is certain. Who may live to tell the story is a very different question. Before this time tomorrow, I shall have gained a peerage or Westminster Abbey." Caught off guard and badly unprepared, Admiral Bruet tried to rally his sailors, but a third of the men were stranded on shore collecting supplies and could not help the doomed French ships. Admiral Bruet had thought he was anchored so close to the shore that the English would be unable to attack him from the landward side. But he was terribly wrong. The apparent shelter of Aboukir Bay proved illusory. To their surprise, the English discovered a gap between the land and the French anchorage. The English ships risked the bay's shallow waters to circle around the French. Most of the French ships, except for the rear guard, were soon caught between the crossfire of 2 English ships from both sides. The English and French locked in a fierce cannonade, with the flashes of 2,000 guns lighting up the ships that, except for a few brief pauses, continued all through the night. The English, whose ships and crews were both superior, also had a terrible weapon that the French did not have, the carronade, a short gun which spat out grape shot and massacred the sailors on deck. The French fought back bravely, but they never stood a chance. There were many acts of heroism that day. Du Petit-Thouars, captain of the Tournon, who had advised in vain that the French fleet should leave the bay, had both his legs torn off, after which he had himself placed in a barrel of bran to command the fighting, refusing to surrender until he finally died from his wounds. Admiral Bruet himself, though horribly wounded in the head and arm, and trying to stop the blood flow with a handkerchief, refused to have his wounds treated below deck. When a cannonball tore off his legs, he was forcibly taken down to his cabin, before again demanding that his men take him back on deck, with the words, "A French admiral ought to die on his own quarterdeck." Having himself strapped to an armchair so he could continue to direct the fight, he was then fatally struck by another cannonball, and only the pieces of his body could be found. Bruet died before 10 p.m, when the battle was about to reach its climax. The Bay of Aboukir now looked like one wide flaming volcano, enveloped in thick black clouds of sulphurous smoke, flames flashing through the sky and lighting up the horizon. Thousands of Egyptians lined the shore, gazing at the spectacle. By 11 p.m, the French flagship, the Orient, after being fired on point blank by 5 English ships, was set ablaze deck by deck. A scene of classical tragedy now took place. Captain de Casablanca had his 10-year-old son, Giacante, serving with him as cabin boy. Knowing that the fire was spreading closer to the ship's powder magazine deep within the hold, containing hundreds of barrels of gunpowder, the father ordered his son to abandon ship along with the crew, but Giacante flatly refused, and bravely tried to stop the flames. But, failing to reach the gunpowder in time, on the deck, surrounded by flames, he threw himself into his father's arms. A few moments later, the Orient blew up in a colossal explosion, and they both entered into legend together. As the scene was later immortalized in the famous poem, "The Boy Stood on the Burning Deck." As the Orient's gunpowder blew up like a grenade, it shook every ship to its core and showered down burning debris, causing severe secondary damage to the other French ships. The blast shook everything within a 25-mile radius and could even be heard 50 miles away. while in Alexandria its fireball lit up the night sky, stunning both sides, who gazed in horror at the spectacle, and the guns fell silent for a 10-minute hiatus. Both the French and English tried to rescue the survivors from the water, but only 70 were saved out of the Orient's entire crew. The other 1,000 men were killed. All that was left of the Orient was a burning, obliterated shell, and all the treasures of Malta and the money Napoleon was counting on to fund his expedition in Egypt sank to the bottom of the sea. Admiral Nelson was also wounded by a splinter to the forehead, and a flap of torn skin temporarily blocked his vision. Believing his wound was fatal and thinking he was about to die, Nelson cried out, "I'm killed! Remember me to my wife!" But when the surgeon inspected his wound, it was found to be only superficial, and after it had been cleaned, Nelson was back on deck. The carnage continued through the night and until noon of the next day, when the firing gradually stopped, for the French fleet, which had majestically sailed from Toulon only a month before, had been all but destroyed. The toll was catastrophic for the French. Only 4 ships managed to escape. The others had been destroyed, except for 2 that the English were able to repair and add to their own fleet. The English fleet was only damaged, though 3 ships did require months of repairs. French losses were 1,700 killed and 1,500 wounded, 3 times the level of English losses of 300 killed and 800 wounded. The shore was strewn with wreckage and the bay littered with floating, mangled and scorched corpses, despite efforts to sink them. As soon as his victory was complete, Nelson signaled for the crews on every ship to gather for prayers to thank God for the victory. Lacking the resources to feed and guard them, the English abandoned 3,000 French prisoners to their fate on the shore. The surviving French ships sailed for Malta, with the English ships too shattered to try to pursue them. The French had some small comfort when, south of Crete, they seized one of the English ships, which had been sent by Nelson to carry home the trophies of his victory. When the news reached England, the First Lord of the Admiralty actually fainted, and celebrations erupted across the country. England immediately bestowed on Nelson his long-coveted peerage, naming him the Baron of the Nile, although Nelson said he would have preferred an earldom and that he would rather have received no title at all than that. But he was also granted a payment of £10,000 a year to be passed down to his 2 immediate heirs. The Sultan of Turkey, Tsar of Russia, King of Piedmont, King of Naples, and the East India Company gave Nelson magnificent presents of jewels, diamonds, medals, and ceremonial swords. The Battle of the Nile was a triumph for England, and also the death blow to French efforts in Egypt. Nelson said of the battle, "Victory is not a name strong enough for such a scene. I trust Almighty God will, in Egypt, overthrow these pests of the human race." Napoleon at once saw that all his hopes had been irreparably dashed. With no fleet, Napoleon and his 55,000 men were now trapped, cut off from Europe and surrounded by enemies on all sides. They could not return to France, and they could expect no supplies or money, no reinforcements, perhaps not even letters or news from home, and certainly not their wives. The French had become prisoners of their own conquest. News of the disaster must have stunned Napoleon, but he took it calmly, without, his entourage all agreed, even a flicker of emotion passing over his face. Telling the aide who'd brought the letter to keep its contents quiet for now, Napoleon then went in to breakfast with his officers, who were all in good spirits after the share out of gold and jewels. Choosing his moment, Napoleon said to his officers, "It seems you like this country. That is very lucky, for we now have no fleet to carry us back to Europe." Then Napoleon gave them the details. "Never mind, We've got everything we need. We can even manufacture gunpowder and cannonballs. We are now obliged to accomplish great things, and we shall. So, let us remember that the overland routes remain open to us in all directions." Before the breakfast was over, Napoleon had communicated his own calm and confidence to his staff, and they did not mention it further. But among his most trusted friends, Napoleon did not conceal the magnitude of the disaster. For a while afterwards, he was heard 2 or 3 times to say to himself, "Unfortunate Brueys, what have you done?" To some who tried to blame Brueys for not anchoring somewhere safe, Napoleon replied, if in this disastrous event he made mistakes, he expiated them by his glorious end. Napoleon put aside his own troubles to write a touching letter of condolence to Admiral Brueys' widow. "Your husband has been killed by a cannonball while fighting on his quarterdeck. He died without suffering, the death the most easy and the most envied by the brave. I feel warmly for your grief." And clearly now thinking of his own grief over Josephine's betrayal, he continued, "The moment which separates us from the object which we love is terrible. We feel isolated on the earth. We almost experience the convulsions of the last agony. Our souls are annihilated. Its connection with the earth is preserved only through the means of a painful dream, which disturbs everything. We feel in such a situation that there is nothing which still binds us to life, that it were far better to die. But when, after such just and unavoidable throes, we press our children to our hearts, tears and more tender feelings arise, and life becomes bearable for their sakes. Yes, madame, they will open the fountains of your heart. You will watch their childhood, educate their youth. You will speak to them of their father, of your present grief, and of the loss which they and the Republic have sustained in his death. After having regained interest in life by the call of motherly love, you will perhaps feel some consolation from the friendship and warm interest which I shall always take in the widow of my friend." Now that his entire army was virtually shipwrecked, Napoleon needed to provide hope and raise the morale of his troops that had reached rock bottom. Publicly at least, rather than despairing or showing discouragement at the crisis, Napoleon appeared to have been invigorated. "We are perhaps destined to change the face of the Orient and place our names beside those that are recalled with the most brilliance from ancient history. We must remain in these lands, or leave them having become as great as the men of ancient times." Napoleon refused to accept what he called this reverse as evidence that fortune had forsaken him. He wrote to the Directory in a report that he must have doubted would now actually be able to reach them. "She has not abandoned us yet, far from it. She has served us during this entire operation beyond anything she has ever done." Napoleon even told General Kléber that the disaster might be beneficial, as the English were now forcing him to consider marching on India. "They will, perhaps, oblige us to do greater things than we propose to perform. We must hold ourselves in readiness. We will, at last, bequeath to Egypt a heritage of greatness. We must die in this country, or get out of it as great as the ancients." Gathering his men, he pointed out that the army still had its transport ships at Alexandria and that France still had a fleet in the Atlantic. Moreover, their army of the Orient was large and victorious and was in control of Egypt. It could do great things and even found an empire. Napoleon's eloquence reassured them, but he was no fool. He saw that now, more than ever, he must make a success of things. Meanwhile, the French soldiers, finding all possibility of returning to France cut off, committed themselves to Napoleon's plans for improving and developing Egypt, which, it now appeared, might well be their home for many years. Napoleon and his army now had to support themselves in this foreign land, or perish. As commander-in-chief of the occupying army, Napoleon alone was responsible for ruling Egypt. He must have thought back to Alexander the Great, as he had once said, "If I was not born Napoleon, I would like to have been born Alexander." Yet, Napoleon's Egyptian empire differed totally from Alexander's in motive and methods. Alexander was essentially a conqueror. His objective was to forcibly impose Greek civilization on the populations he controlled, and his empire did not survive him. By contrast, Napoleon imagined the active participation of the Egyptian people in their own liberation from the Mamelukes' foreign yoke. Napoleon refused sovereignty over Egypt, and his method was self-government, a humanistic, decentralized protectorate rather than a brutal annexation. He abolished feudalism, and instead, in each of Egypt's 14 provinces, set up a diwan of up to 9 members, but advised by a French civilian to look after local policing, food, supplies, and sanitation. Napoleon visited the most influential Arab inhabitants, assured them of his friendship, his respect for Islam, his determination to protect their rights, and his desire to restore Egypt to its former glory. Napoleon's meetings with these men seem to have been good-humoured. One Muslim historian recorded that Napoleon was cheerful and sociable with the gathered people and used to joke with them. To advise him, Napoleon created a consultative council of 189 prominent Egyptians. This, he explained, would accustom the Egyptian notables to the ideas of assembly and government. During this period, Cairo was considered the second city of the Ottoman Empire, containing 500,000 people, making it larger than Paris and easily the largest city in Africa. It was a renowned trading centre with large seasonal caravans of hundreds of camels arriving from as far afield as Aleppo, Mecca, Darfur, and Timbuktu, 2,000 miles away on the other side of the Sahara Desert. The city was just a mile from the Nile and was commanded by a citadel with its own aqueduct, but which was neglected and falling to ruins as the Mamelukes never repaired anything. The streets were built very high and narrow to create shelter from the sun. Cairo had more than 300 mosques, mainly for lodging its pilgrims, and from whose minarets the voices of the muezzins, traditionally roles held by blind men, so that when they looked down from the minarets, they could not see into the exposed private rooms of the houses below, would ring out over the rooftops day and night, with regular calls to prayer. The sky over Cairo was blighted by brown smog from the household cooking fires, many of which used dry dung for fuel. It abounded in coffee houses, where the Egyptians met to have coffee, sherbet, and opium, and discuss public affairs. In one quarter of Cairo were a few European families, and some convents for the Syrian Catholics. Close by, towards the desert, was the City of the Dead, which was larger than Cairo itself. Every family had its burial place there, with attendants for many of the tombs who kept their lamps burning and showed the interior to the curious. Napoleon was faced with a city where piles of rubbish lay festering in open areas, waiting to be carried away by the yearly flooding of the Nile, where 1 in 5 of the population had at least one sightless milky eye, where the dead were buried in open spaces, their graves desecrated by packs of scavenging dogs. All of this harked back to the medieval times, a world which had, by and large, disappeared from Europe 300 years before. At the height of the Pharaohs over 3,000 years ago, Egypt's population had been estimated at over 20 million. Now, through stagnation and tyranny, these numbers had dwindled away, and at the time of the French expedition, Egypt only had 2.5 million people. Its society was divided into 4 classes. First came the Copts, 200,000 in all, the descendants of the ancient Egyptians, reduced to degradation and beggary. The majority of the population, 2 million, were Arabs, who were barred from business and trade. The Turks, or Janissaries, 200,000 strong, made up the standing army, which kept the people in subjection, through the scimitar, the torture of the bastinado, and the bowstring method of execution. Then, of course, came the elites, the all-powerful Mamelukes. Egypt's technical and economic development was one of Napoleon's main concerns, and he quickly set in motion an extensive program of reform. In a series of decrees, he set up Egypt's first regular postal service and a stagecoach service between Cairo and Alexandria. He started a mint to turn Mameluke gold into French coins. He built the first street lamps in Cairo, 30 feet apart on the main streets, and each house was now forced to possess a hanging lantern lit at night. Now, with the streets properly lit, a concerted operation was launched against the packs of rabid dogs who roamed the alleyways in packs. It was said that, throughout the country, the number of wild dogs may well have outnumbered the population. In the course of one night, the dogs were all poisoned, a move which bemused the locals. Al-Jabati was convinced that this was simply revenge against the dogs for the disrespect they showed the French, because when they passed through the streets at night, the dogs would follow them barking. Napoleon set up 4 hospitals, able to treat 600 patients, all to be ready in 8 days, and began work on a 300-bed hospital for the poor, with a separate bed for each patient. He also set up 4 quarantine stations to check one of the scourges of Egypt, the bubonic plague, and built modern hospitals to try to treat it. Napoleon had brought with him a set of Arabic type, and with it produced Egypt's first printed books, in 3 different languages. Nothing political, but manuals on how to treat ophthalmia, smallpox, and the bubonic plague. At the same time, efforts were made to make the streets more hygienic. In Cairo, as well as near other towns, were huge, daily increasing mounds of rubbish where everything from the city was dumped. The French instantly wanted to clear it, but difficulties cropped up, as experience had taught the locals that it was dangerous to throw this rubbish into the Nile, where it either blocked up the canals or was spread over the countryside when it flooded. As a compromise, Napoleon declared that the dumping of rubbish inside the city was only allowed at designated spots, which were cleared daily, and soon burial was no longer allowed within the city walls. None of Napoleon's reforms were carried out on orders of the Directory, who were unable to get their messages through the English blockade. They were entirely on Napoleon's initiative. Yet, such a reform program cost money, and this was soon in short supply. As well as cutting him off from France, the Aboukir Bay naval catastrophe left Napoleon with an urgent cash flow problem, since the money and treasures from Malta had sunk to the bottom of the ocean, along with the Orient. But in Cairo, Napoleon found that the Mamelukes had long since drained the treasury dry, while his army's wage bill came to 1,000,000 francs a month, which it seemed he was not able to pay. The soldiers' main currency in the bazaars continued to have to be the brass buttons from their uniforms. Luckily, food was plentiful, and suppliers were issued promissory notes for rice, beans, lentils, and vegetables, as well as sheep and goats from outside the city. In an effort to raise some immediate cash, Napoleon ordered a tax on all wealthy merchants, even feeling this move might increase his popularity amongst the downtrodden urban poor, who resented the merchants for living at their expense. Napoleon also created a rational tax system, with lower taxes on the Egyptian peasantry than the Mamelukes' extortionate demands. When Napoleon heard that the wives of many of the wealthy Mamelukes were still roaming the countryside outside Cairo, abandoned by their masters and preyed on by Bedouin tribes, Napoleon sent them an armistice, allowing them to return to their palaces in Cairo. But for this privilege, each of them would be required to pay a large ransom. In this way, Napoleon hoped to gain access to the treasures which he knew had been hidden away in the Mameluke palaces and elsewhere. When Seti Nafisa, Murad Bey's wife, arrived back at her palace, Napoleon sent his teenage stepson and aide-de-camp, Eugène, to pay a courtesy call, assure her of his protection, preserve all her property, and grant any request she had. Seti Nafisa was a powerful woman, having been married to the great Mamluk ruler Ali Bey before marrying Murad. Besides being extremely rich, she was also respected throughout Cairo, and even in these trying times, continued to maintain her husband's household, including a harem of 50 women of all countries and colours. Seti Nafisa led Urgen into the harem, served him a sumptuous meal, and gave him a very valuable ring. Yet, all her lavish hospitality was to no avail, as she was still required to pay 600,000 francs to the French. Napoleon knew that these forced levies could only be a temporary measure, but he also realised that he could expect little regular financial support from the Directory back in France. They would be the first to point out that a colony was expected to send goods back to the mother country, rather than drain its resources. With this in mind, Napoleon planned to send to France regular convoys, containing expensive coffee, sugar and cotton, as well as other Egyptian products, like rice and dried beans. He also had high hopes of creating a lucrative trade in spices and other luxury goods from the Far East. To this end, he set up a new French trading company. However, as Napoleon explained in his reports to the Directory, before such trade could begin, he first had to firmly establish a French colony, which would require further military support, especially cavalry. Life in Egypt proved very different to what the French had expected. Bourrienne insisted that from the moment the army set foot in Egypt, almost everyone was overcome with disgust, disquiet, discontent, and homesickness. When the French first arrived, there were no ovens to bake bread, no decent wine, no printing presses to produce newspapers, and little that they could call entertainment. Napoleon had originally chosen to bring with him the intellectuals for his own grand vision, instead of entertainers for his troops. But Napoleon knew that morale was important, especially after his fleet's destruction at Abu Qir Bay, so he ordered ovens to be built, wine produced, and 2 newspapers printed. To ease his troops' homesickness, Napoleon implemented certain ideas to suit more French tastes, including the opening of the Tivoli Egyptienne, a luscious garden based on the famous Parisian park, with a club, games, swings and jugglers, where the spectators could eat ices or listen to military bands. The French soldiers also tried to acclimatise. They were seen in the locals' houses, socially smoking their pipes, helping with their household tasks and playing with their children. Napoleon sent back a list of essentials that he wished to be sent from France, mainly things to improve his troops' morale: a troupe of comedians, a troupe of ballerinas, at least 2 or 3 puppeteers, 100 French women, the wives of all those who are stationed out here, 30 pharmacists, 10 physicians, some iron foundry men, some liquor makers and distillers, 50 gardeners with their families and seeds of all types of vegetables. Each convoy must bring 200,000 pints of eau-de-vie and 1,000,000 pints of wine. Such were the essentials of a French colony, without which Napoleon thought it would be impossible to lay down the foundations of civilization. But still, Bourrienne insisted that any illusions about the expedition had disappeared from the outset. There remained nothing more than the reality, which was sad indeed. The bitter complaints that I heard from Murat, Lannes, Berthier, and so many others, endless unrestrained complaining, which often bordered on sedition, affected Napoleon deeply. General Dumas, who during the grueling desert march to Cairo had challenged Napoleon's leadership, sparking a heated scene that soured their friendship, now asked him for permission to resign his command and return to France. During their final meeting, according to Desgenais, an army doctor, Napoleon told Dumas that if he had been unlucky enough to tell me not to march further than Cairo, I would have shot you with no further formality. When that had been accomplished, I would have had you tried by the grenadiers of the army, and I would have covered your memory with opprobrium. Then Dumas actually started to cry, which made Napoleon again feel at peace right away. He let Dumas leave Egypt. I can easily replace him with a brigadier. However, Napoleon certainly felt betrayed by his one-time friend, who he had personally promoted to high command. Unluckily for Dumas, He was captured by the Neapolitan army while trying to sail back to France, and was held as a prisoner of war for 2 years. Isolated in his cell and malnourished, Dumas became partially paralysed and almost blind in one eye, all of which he believed was caused by poisoning, though he was helped by a secret local pro-French group which brought him medicine. Dumas's wife lobbied Napoleon, who was by then in power, to find and rescue her husband, to little result. Eventually, Napoleon's forces secured Dumas's release in March 1801. Returning to France, Dumas struggled to support his family and repeatedly wrote to Napoleon seeking back pay for his time lost in prison and to be reinstated to the army. But Napoleon, clearly holding a grudge, refused, and according to one account, demanded, "Do not speak to me of that man." Dumas's health was broken by his long imprisonment, and he died a few years later. His widow tried for years to obtain the pension due to her late husband, but to no avail. When, in 1810, Dissent, by then director of the Louvre, commissioned a painting of a famous attack that took place in Egypt, which Dumas himself had heroically led, he was not depicted, and instead was replaced by a blonde hussar. In Egypt, most remained steadfast to Napoleon. One night, at a drunken party, his old and loyal friend, General Junot, heard another general, Lannoux, speak sarcastically about the army's condition, in criticism of Napoleon. The fiery Junot was instantly enraged, denouncing Lannoux as a traitor, who retorted that Junot was a scoundrel. Swords were drawn, and everyone leapt to their feet. "Listen, I called you a traitor. I do not think that you are one. You called me a scoundrel. You know that I am not such. But we must fight. One of us must die. I hate you, for you have abused the man whom I love and admire as much as I do God, if not more." Then, by torchlight, the two drunken generals went down to the garden, which sloped to the Nile, and cut at each other with their swords, until Lannous's head was split open, and Junot got a deep 8-inch slash in the stomach. The next morning, when Napoleon, who disapproved of duelling and forbid it in the army, heard of the fight, he was very displeased. What? Are they determined to cut each other's throats? Must they go into the midst of the reeds of the Nile to dispute it with the crocodiles? Have they not enough then with the Arabs, the plague, and the Mamelukes? You deserve, Junot, he added, as if he were in front of him. You richly deserve, as soon as you get well, to be put under arrest for a month. But then he softened. My poor Junot, wounded for me. As Napoleon later put it, the French hated Egypt because, unlike in Italy, there was no wine, no forks, and no countesses to make love to. But Napoleon liked Egypt. Not the flies, dirt, and disease, but the land and the way of life. Napoleon means lion of the desert, and he took to the desert, as most do who love the sea. Napoleon was impressed by the healthy climate and the fertile land around the Nile, and actually enjoyed crossing the great flat wastelands of sand, most often by a horse, but sometimes on a camel. I never passed the desert without experiencing very powerful emotions. It was the image of immensity to my thoughts. It displayed no limits. It had neither beginning nor end. It was an ocean for the foot of man. The Spartan side of Napoleon's character responded to the Egyptians' simple life, where possessions counted for little and character for much. Napoleon also liked the Egyptians' trust in providence, in which he himself was a firm believer. Once, Napoleon fell asleep beneath an ancient wall, which suddenly collapsed. But he woke up uninjured, and in his hand was what looked like a stone. It turned out to be a beautiful cameo of the Roman Emperor Augustus. Another time, when he visited the ruins of Pelusium, he found a medallion of Julius Caesar, which he naturally took as a good omen. Above all, perhaps, Napoleon liked the name which the Egyptians called him, Sultan el-Kebir, or Sultan of Fire. More than a translation of Commander-in-Chief, it implied that they accepted Napoleon instead of the Sultan of Turkey as their ruler. The Egyptians respected Napoleon. In his ode to Bonaparte, Nicholas the Turk wrote that, His name put fear into the heart of kings. The kings bowed their heads before the invincible Bonaparte, before the lion of battle. His courage makes him the master of irrevocable destiny, and the skies of glory lower themselves before him. First, the Egyptians saw a man of energy and meticulous habits, who worked 12-hour days in the scorching heat, with his uniform in perfect order. They saw a general who, though the lash was forbidden in his army, managed to keep discipline. When some soldiers stole dates from a private garden, Napoleon stopped it from happening again by playing on the French fear of dishonor. He ordered that twice a day they will be marched around the camp, with their uniforms turned inside out, carrying the dates and a placard with the word looter. The Egyptians were astonished that Napoleon, a conqueror, could be so disinterested and self-denying, which was rare among Eastern potentates. Dissipation did not tempt him. "I have no passion," Napoleon claimed, "for women or gambling. I am entirely a political being." One day, an Arab tribe came to meet Napoleon to pay their respects, and offered to be his guides. The son of the chief of the tribe, a 12-year-old boy, rode by Napoleon's side on a camel and said to him, "Sultan al-Kibir, I could give you good advice now that you are returning to Cairo." "Well, speak, my friend. If your advice is good, I will follow it." "I will tell you what I would do were I in your place. As soon as I got to Cairo, I would send for the richest slave merchant in the market, and I would choose 20 of the prettiest women for myself. I would then send for the richest jewelers and would make them give me up a good share of their stock. I would then do the same with all the other merchants. For what is the use of reigning or being powerful if not to acquire riches?" Napoleon replied, "But, my friend, suppose it were more noble to preserve these things for others." The Egyptians saw a man who cared about justice, as the Turks never had. He took vigorous measures against the robbers of the desert, who, for centuries, had devastated the frontiers. One day, at a meeting with sheikhs, Napoleon learned that some Arabs of the tribe of the Osnades had murdered a fellah and carried off the village's flock of sheep. Napoleon called one of his officers and ordered, "Take 300 horsemen and 200 camels, and pursue those robbers until they are captured, and the outrage avenged." "Was the poor wretch your cousin?" one of the sheikhs joked, "that you're in such a rage at his death?" "He was more," Napoleon replied. "He was one whose safety Providence has entrusted to my care." "Wonderful," the sheikh replied, bowing low. "You speak like one inspired by the Almighty." Like every visitor to Egypt, Napoleon took a keen interest in the pyramids. Not long after his arrival in Cairo, Napoleon rode out to visit them with his officers. Among them was Berthier, whose love for his mistress, Madame Visconti, was taking on extravagant proportions. Berthier kept announcing to Napoleon that he wanted to resign and rejoin her in Italy. Berthier would gaze dotingly at the moon, at the exact moment when he knew his beloved in Milan would first catch sight of it. And he devised a special tent, carried by 3 mules, which was a shrine to her. It contained an altar where he laid her portrait, in front of which he burned incense. Napoleon could not resist poking fun at poor Berthier over this, and would enter the shrine tent with his boots still on, lounging casually on the divan, which made Berthier splutter that he was profaning the sanctuary. Napoleon and his entourage arrived at the Great Pyramids to inspect the work he had ordered of clearing sand from the half-buried Sphinx. Incidentally, it is often falsely repeated to tourists to this day that the Sphinx lost its nose after Napoleon's troops used it for target practice. Yet, a painting of the Sphinx by Naudin, made 40 years before this expedition, showed that its nose had already been missing even then. Napoleon suggested that some of his entourage race to the top of the pyramid, and was highly amused by the sight of his officers and scholars scrambling up the crumbling stone slabs, especially when the lovesick Berthier soon lost the will to continue and disconsolately stopped halfway up. "Coming down already!" Napoleon shouted up to him. "She's not at the summit, my poor Berthier. But she's not down here either. Surprisingly, the 53-year-old mathematician Monge, helped by a flask of eau-de-vie, was the first to reach the summit. Lieutenant Devernois, who climbed to the top some weeks later, described the view. You look down to see a vast sweep of countryside, a spectacle more imposing than you can possibly imagine. To the west, the view stretches into the immensity of the bare arid desert, while to the east, the fertile valley of the Nile, all green with vegetation, rolls away into the far distance. Compared with the enormous mass of this mountain of stones, the people far below at its feet appear like crawling ants. As the other members of Napoleon's staff reached the summit, far below, they could see Napoleon standing alone, lost in thought. Napoleon afterwards said that, of all the things that had impressed him in his life, the pyramids were among those that had most astonished him. But when his staff climbed down the pyramid, it became clear that Napoleon had not been preoccupied with the timeless wonder of it, but with the more mundane facts of its construction. Almost a decade earlier, as a second lieutenant, Napoleon had copied into his notebook the dimensions of the Great Pyramid, including its mass in cubic fathoms. This figure had clearly stayed in Napoleon's mind. And after inspecting the pyramid, Napoleon told Monge that with all the stones in that monument, a wall could be built all the way around Paris, 1 meter wide and 3 meters high. Monge later worked it out for himself and confirmed that Napoleon's calculation was correct. Equally interesting is the way that Napoleon looked at the pyramids. Not about the power of the pharaohs, nor the tomb, or the technical problem of building it, but instead, he was thinking of France. Other members of the Egyptian expedition explored the Great Pyramid, which had only been opened up again a few years before. Savary was one of the first to enter, and began to descend, each holding a burning torch. Towards the bottom, we had to wriggle on our bellies like snakes to gain access to the inner passageway. We scrambled up this on our knees, at the same time pressing out hands against the sides. Had we not done this, we risked slipping backwards, and the slightest grooves on its surface would not have been able to stop us from sliding all the way down to the bottom. About halfway up, we fired a pistol shot, whose deafening noise echoed away forever through all the distant recesses of the immense edifice. This awakened thousands of bats, which hurtled down, striking us on our hands and face, and extinguishing several of our torches. When Napoleon himself entered Khufu's Great Pyramid after exploring its tomb, he asked to be left alone in there for a while, and everyone else waited outside. When Napoleon eventually emerged, all of the colour had drained from his face, and he looked absolutely shaken. When asked what had happened, he refused to talk about it, insisting that the incident never be spoken of again. Some have suggested that Napoleon was granted a vision of his future, or that he even saw Alexander the Great, who allegedly spent a night alone in the tomb. But, according to French folk legend, it was here that Napoleon supposedly first encountered the mysterious and fabled Little Red Man of Destiny. So the story goes, this was a supernatural spirit shaped like a red man, which, for 300 years, visited some of France's most famous personalities, gaining a reputation as a harbinger of tragedy. In Napoleon's case, the entity was said to have not only foretold his future, but even to have guided and advised him. The eerie entity usually seemed to centre its activity in Paris, at the royal palace of the Tuileries. Some said it was the ghost of John the Flayer, a henchman of the notorious French queen, Catherine de Medici, who was murdered in the palace gardens on her orders because he knew too much of the crown's secrets, and they never found his body. Catherine de Medici was said to have been the first to see the apparition. In 1564, while the Tuileries Palace was being built, she came face to face with a gnome-like creature dressed in scarlet, which warned her that she would die near Saint-Germain. Catherine suddenly decided to abandon the newly built palace, which was in the parish of Saint-Germain, refusing to visit the area again. But she found it was impossible to cheat fate. When she fell fatally ill, she discovered that the monk who was giving her the last sacraments had the surname Saint-Germain. Ever since then, every time an important event, usually bad, was about to happen to a French ruler, legend has it that the little red man appeared at the Tuileries. In 1610, Henry IV supposedly saw him on the morning of the day that he was assassinated by an insane schoolteacher. Anne of Austria saw him a few days before the Fronde Rebellion began. Marie Antoinette saw him in the corridor the day before the mob stormed the Tuileries and ended the monarchy. And again, in 1792, startled chambermaids discovered the small scarlet man in the bed of Louis XVI when he was planning his futile escape from the French revolutionaries, and again when he was imprisoned and awaiting the guillotine. After this, outside the Tuileries, a shrine was set up to the assassinated French revolutionary Marat. Its overnight guard was found dead at his post. The official cause of death was exposure to the cold in the middle of July, leading some to claim that he died of fright at the sight of the ghost. For Napoleon, the story goes that here in Egypt, the little red man materialized before his eyes, and according to one version of the legend, either predicted his future or even made a bargain with him, granting him success and victory on the battlefields of Europe for 10 years. The spirit claimed to have advised the rulers of France in the past, and that he had been at Napoleon's side since he had been a schoolboy. I know you better than you know yourself, prophesying that the Egyptian campaign would be destined to fail, and that Napoleon would return to France to find enemy powers surrounding his country. The spirit also supposedly muttered the ominous word, Moscow. Whether Napoleon saw a vision or a ghost of some sort, what is certain is that it must have taken a lot to scare him. Only on Napoleon's deathbed did a friend ask him to reveal the mystery of what actually happened inside the pyramid on that day. Napoleon seemed ready to speak, but then he shook his head and cryptically refused. No, what's the use? You'd never believe me.